and welcome back to my channel. Bonsoir et bienvenue sur ma chaîne. My name is Muriel, and this evening I'll be doing a straight up review, but also a preliminary review, if you will, of Dune by none other than Frank Herbert. I have finally read it, and I'm still in the process of reading the 5 other books. I'm actually pretty close to finishing Dune Messiah, but as I've stated before, I'll only be doing a, first review for Dune, the first novel in the series, and then I'll do a series review once I've finished the entire hexalogy. Now, before I get into the review proper, I just want to make a quick little note that probably doesn't really interest anyone but myself, but just for the sake of clarity. In the past, sometimes titled my reviews, this is a casual review, this is more of a formal review. I've decided that it's all pretty much irrelevant, a waste of time, and it does nothing more than limit myself or constrain myself and stress me out. So I'll basically be doing either single reviews, sometimes I'll do dual reviews, or series reviews or rant reviews or things like that. But I mean, most of the time, yes, I'll be following my formalized analysis formula, that includes writing style, world building, theming, character work, etc. And sometimes, especially in the case of an entire series being reviewed, I'll be a bit more casual and just let myself wander from thought and feeling to thought and feeling about what I just read. The best example of that being my truly casual review of The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion. Otherwise, I'm just not making the distinction anymore. But so on to what you're all actually interested about, which is the review for Dune, which will be, I guess, a bit more casual than usual because I'm not going to go too deeply into themes or things like that because I want to keep that for my series review. So in any case, as an introduction, do I really need to introduce this for starters? But so Dune and its 5 sequels is considered one of the greatest science fiction novels and series of all time. It's right up there with other series like The Foundation by Isaac Asimov, or I guess maybe The Hyperion Cantos is undervalued slightly, somewhat, with regards to those two. But, those general works of epic proportion science fiction. A quick little note on the debate surrounding what genre of speculative fiction this specifically belongs to. The one thing I don't think it matters all that much, CF, Sir Arthur C. Clarke's comments on science fiction fantasy. In my personal opinion, I do think this is really more science fiction than anything else. You can make a case, yes, for it being science fantasy because of all discussions around religion and quasi-mystical experiences and prescience and things like that. But I still personally think it's more science fiction than anything else. I will say, though, as there is such a subgenre as epic or high fantasy, I would say this is epic/high science fiction. I guess it also technically qualifies for the space opera subgenre, but yeah, I'm going to stick with epic science fiction. Another thing I can add is that, first of all, this particular edition is absolutely monstrously ugly, but it was also a bit shorter than most other editions I've come across. This was only about 500 pages. Most more recent editions, I guess, gravitate around 600 to 700 pages. I read this reasonably quickly at first, then I had some mental health issues and I dropped it for a few days, but then I picked it up again and went through it fairly quickly. The narrative is linear. I mean, there are flashbacks of sorts, but it's a straightforward linear progression, so that makes it fairly easy to follow, in my opinion. But even though everyone at this point, or I mean, a lot of people in the ASOIAF community at this point know of Dune, especially now that Denis Villeneuve's adaptation is, it's done, it's just won't be released until next year, unfortunately, because of COVID. But a brief summary of the plot. Dune, the first novel at least, follows the Atreides family within a galactic empire, and this galactic empire runs on something called spice or melange, which is a substance that enhances lifespan, prescient hypercognitive abilities and things like that. You've got different political / religious institutions that gravitate around that. You've got the Spacing Guild, which has a monopoly on operating space travel. You've got the Bene Gesserit, which is a sisterhood of women trying to perfect humankind with extensive breeding programs, but then they themselves have extensive training with regards to almost parapsychological abilities of extreme biofeedback techniques and muscle control and mental analysis faculties, etc., etc. And then you have all these noble families which are under the governance of an emperor. And so you have the Atreides family that inherits the fiefdom of the planet Arrakis, also known as Dune, which is the only place in the known universe where you can find the spice. The spice is produced through a specific biological process by animals called sandworms, which are ginormous worm-like creatures. I would like more details about the exact biology of those beasties, but it's kind of a trap because the Atreides family has a long-standing feud with a cousin family called the Harkonnens, and also the head of that family, Leto, Duke Leto Atreides, is married to one of these Bene Gesserit priestesses, women. They're also called witches because they are feared. And this woman, Lady Jessica, is supposed to produce a child that will then ideally be married off to a child of the Harkonnen family. So they will produce what is called a Kwisatz Haderach, which is supposed to be basically the next step in human evolution, a superhuman. But that kind of goes awry. Lady Jessica was supposed to have a daughter, but she bears a son for the Duke Leto because she loves him, and Duke Leto really wanted a male heir, so she broke her Bene Gesserit vows of duty and obedience to produce a son. And Paul Atreides, well, goes through a journey on Arrakis, and that is linked to ideas of prophecy, messianic figures, prescience. Is he the Kwisatz Haderach that has long been awaited by the Bene Gesserit? I won't say more, but you'll have to find out for yourselves. What I did love, though, but this ties in directly to the writing style and also the world building, but I'll come back to that, is that each chapter, they aren't really delineated as chapters, but I counted them as chapters. Each chapter is headed by an excerpt from like a historical document from the future, but not the future like thousands of years, like the future that happens basically in books 2 and 3 and are written by a character you get to know a bit more towards the end of book 1 and more so in Dune Messiah. And that's great because it gives you background information for the world building, so I really appreciate it. I love that formula. I've encountered it a few times in ASOIAF books. The main example that springs to mind, actually, and I'll come back to it, is The Left Hand of Darkness. It employs a similar writing / world building device. With regards to the writing style itself, I fairly enjoyed it. It's hard to pinpoint why exactly, but I didn't feel it was as, or quite as stilted as some of the other older science fiction I've read this year. It read fairly straightforwardly and easily. There's insanely good philosophical and political commentary inserted in the writing, but that goes back to the theming and the world building. There's some beautiful descriptions of the planet Arrakis and the dune landscapes and the clothes of the Fremen, of the Atreides retainers, of everything, but not too much. There's a good balance between descriptions, action, character interactions, and things like that. And it really, in particular, the descriptions of the landscapes and the attention to the ecology of Arrakis just sang to my soul. I love that so freaking much. This book is just smart. I'm going to say that a few times. It's so smart, especially with regards to, like I said, the world building and the theming. I wrote down so many quotes from this, it was kind of ridiculous, actually. One point, though, where I will say I don't think Frank Herbert did as well was with his dialogue. and his character interactions, but that will link to the character work, which I'll get to in a minute. I don't know why it was written that way. I don't know if it's a publishing thing or if he actually wrote it down exactly that way, but a lot of the times characters will go like, ah, and it's written with like 5 A's and 3 H's and brackets, and it sounds, or I mean, it reads so weird. It feels so clunky and unnatural, and I was like, what are you doing there, mate? I'm not, why? Just why? So that'd be my major issue with the writing in that regard. With regards to character work, see, so here is where I think Frank Herbert wasn't as skilled of a writer. I still think the guy was a genius, by the way, so this is by no means demeaning. There was good character work in psychology, because you do spend a lot of time in a lot of the characters' heads, especially main characters like Paul Atreides or the Lady Jessica. But since I think Dune is primarily about its ideas and its world building, it often felt like the characters were mouthpieces for Frank Herbert's philosophizing about politics, about religion, about human evolution, about ecology, and things like that. So sometimes it didn't feel quite as natural as I would have liked it to be. And I also alluded to that issue with dialogue where you've got these weird sighs and expressions of, that lasts for way too many letters. That was so weird. And also one minor quibble without spoiling too much of anything. And again, if you're a bit familiar with what Dune is about, so Paul Atreides, which is supposed to perhaps maybe become a messianic figure, though that might not be a good thing. Well, he's gifted with all these incredible mental faculties because his mother is a Bene Gesserit priestess lady who has trained him in their ways. He's also received training from a man who was a mentat, and mentat are meant to be human computers, because I forgot to add, one of the particularities of the Duneverse is that in that galactic empire, I mean, by the time of the story of Dune, it's basically been decreed that AI should be outlawed for all time, and that machines that imitate the human mind are an abomination, and they were all destroyed in something called the Butlerian Jihad. But that goes back to world building, obviously. So he was trained by a mentat who kind of is like a human computer, so he already has all of these amazing abilities through training. He has these latent abilities through this selective breeding program that the Bene Gesserit have been orchestrating for hundreds of years. And so he has an awakening. I'll just leave it at that. He has an awakening in the desert, which also has heavy religious references and symbolism attached, if you think about it. I did think it happened a bit too quickly, though. I felt the transition from Paul, this young adolescent, because he's only 15, who is gifted, yes, but isn't yet quite superhuman, to this seedling of a messianic figure, it was a bit too abrupt. I don't know. Something about it felt a bit too, again, clunky to me. I was like, you didn't show me enough of it. You told me, but you didn't show me. But that's my only real quibble with regards to that. Or maybe, well, no, I have another one. It's that, again, without wanting to spoil much of anything, but there is a love interest for Paul Atreides, and I don't know. I felt, again, it was a bit rushed. I didn't really see its organic flowering, I guess. So 1 minute it's not really there, though it's suggested again because of prescience and prophecy and things like that. And the other minute, there's a couple who love each other incredibly, like soulmate level of love and devotion. And I'm like, yeah, that could have been fleshed out a bit better. And the world building, so that's where I got off. Basically, the world building is admirable and theming is admirable, but they really do go together, but I'll talk about them separately and not too extensively for now. But oh my god, I felt I was on that bloody planet Arrakis, and I say it that way because I'm someone who doesn't like heat at all. I would not survive a second on that planet. There is no great body of water on Arrakis. It is literally, in its entirety, a desert planet. I do think ice caps at the poles are mentioned, but otherwise it's basically rock and sand and dirt and dust, which provides a sea in which the big sandworms can, I guess, swim about and produce the spice melange, which basically fuels the economy and the functioning of this galactic empire. Interesting to note that spice is kind of an analogy for oil in the Middle East. Or, I mean, this analogy has been made, and yeah, I mean, you can kind of see it. I might touch upon that a bit more in my series review. And the thing that I really loved and appreciated, so you do have a couple of annexes at the end of at least the first Dune book, where things like terraforming are explained and background information on the history of the Galactic Empire, its religious history more specifically, and the evolution of its religious currents. Okay, so Frank Herbert, I learned, he researched these topics for 6 years before writing his Dune saga. It shows. It absolutely bloody shows. And it shows he understood what ecology is all about. As someone who started studies in biology and had intended to go into ecological sciences, this was my jam. I love this so much. The magnificent symbiotic relationship between the Fremen, which is the main native people of Arrakis, and their environment, that desert, extremely dry environment where water is the most precious thing you can own, was magnificently portrayed. The only, or perhaps not the only, but a shining example of that Dune reminded me of was actually The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula K. Le Guin, because in that novel, though it is a lot shorter and it is a single novel, does a brilliant job of exploring the relationship between the humans of Gethin, which also has like a colloquial name, Winter. Here it's Arrakis and Dune. So between people of Gethin and their environment, it's basically the polar opposite of Arrakis, because Gethin is like the frozen planet, the snow like 10 months out of 12. There are no flighted animals because that would burn too many calories, and human beings have evolved to become hermaphroditic to adapt to the very harsh conditions. And actually that book also addresses politics, though from a different angle, and also religion. It's really interesting, but these two books have a lot of parallels in different ways, but they have a lot of parallels. I found that very interesting. But the level of symbiosis and the way the relationship between people and environment is explored and developed was very similar between these two novels, and I really love that. I also found the exploration of like AI, or I mean, there is no AI, but so the ultra development of human computing faculties are very interesting, because so since AI has been banned to a religious extent, like it would be a sin for people to try and make computers again after this Butlerian jihad, which happened 10,000 years ago by the time this story starts, was fascinating. Because I mean, they do have machines, they do have advanced technology, they've got atomic weapons, they've got these weird shields that cover their bodies, and they have obviously spaceships, and they have these, well, the Fremen have these suits that recapture every ounce of moisture their own bodies produce, so they won't die of thirst. So you do have technology. That's why I think it's still very much within the domain of science fiction specifically. But the aspect of computing, of just using that raw brain power, which, I mean, computers don't have brain power, but you know what I mean. That was really interesting to see how they adapted to that prohibition on AI, basically. And I'm sure, I mean, I know this for a fact because I've explored and researched Dune before actually reading the book. I know this is going to be developed further in the following books in the series. One tiny thing that did bother me, though, it's a very, very minor point, but it's one of my pet peeves in fiction, especially fiction, I guess science fiction specifically, that addresses like human evolution and humans' relationship with the environment or with animals, etc. I do think Frank Herbert, from the way he understood things, had deep respect for nature and ecological balance, but I don't like the fact that the Bene Gesserit and other people in the story really put humans on a pedestal above other animal species. There's a clear distinction made between humans and lower animals, and like animals can't project themselves into the future and are just a bit, you know, like automatons living in the here and now. When that is not the case, that has been proven not to be the case. There are lots of species that can mental time travel, perhaps not to the exact same extent as we can, sure. I mean, that might not even reflect anything Frank Herbert believed himself. Again, I'm not assigning authorial intent. I'm just saying that's a motif I found in Dune that annoyed me. I found it in other works of science fiction. I never enjoyed it. It's a minor pet peeve of mine, but, I had to mention it. And finally, a quick word on the themes, but I want to reserve this for when I finish the entire series. But once more, I have to stress how smart this novel is, and how this series is undoubtedly going to be. Just wow, like I said, the amount of things I wrote down just from Dune, it got tiring after a while. I was like, oh, again, a clever quote. Mate, I'm tired of writing. The dude understood politics, the dude understood religion and the interrelationship between the two. And I mean, there are lots of videos out there you can go check out about the themes of Dune as well. I'll already link once again Quinn Howard's channel, Quinn's Ideas, who's kind of known as the Dune guy on YouTube. I'll link it again when I do my series review, but he's done a shit ton of videos on Dune specifically. I mean, it's just so clever and deep and philosophical. Perhaps a wee bit too much at times, which is why it kind of affects the character work and maybe the story enjoyment in a way. But yeah, briefly, you've got themes like religion, politics, human evolution, the ethics of controlling and directing human evolution, the ethics of doing something horrible but for a greater, more beneficent cause, the idea of the charismatic leader, the Messiah. Are they ever really a good thing, even if the individuals themselves start out with great, wonderful ideals? Spoiler alert, the answer is no. But yeah. And of course, the interaction between human beings and their environment. There's, I think, points being made about ecological balance and things like that. I think if you really want to appreciate these books to a certain degree, you need to go in there with the idea that you're gonna exercise your brain. You're gonna make those brain cells sweat, metaphorically, a little bit, if you really want to appreciate it, at least in my opinion. To me, this book wasn't perfect by any means. I want to make that very clear. So my rating for Dune, the first novel in the series, is a solid 7.5 out of 10. To me, that's a very high rating, by the way. I guess on Goodreads, I bumped it up to like 4 stars out of 5. So it's not perfect by any means. And I really want to wait and see how I'm going to rate the entire series as its own entity. I will say, though, I really enjoyed seeing, well, like I said, parallels with The Left Hand of Darkness, of all things. Seeing also some traces of Dune in Song of Ice and Fire, especially with regards to the role of politics and religion. So that was really great. I'm excited to continue the series. I mean, I'm almost done with Dune Messiah. It's a lot shorter than Dune, and then I'll be on to Children of Dune and 3 others in the series. I'm very excited now for the movie adaptation by Denis Villeneuve, which will be coming out in autumn of 2021, I believe. So that about wraps up my review for Dune by Frank Herbert. I just cannot get over how ugly this cover is. This was my dad's copy. It's basically a still from the David Lynch movie adaptation, but I've already actually bought new editions, which are a lot prettier, but they've yet to arrive in the mail. So, on that note, I hope you're all doing well, reasonably well. Hope you'll have a lovely day, evening, or whichever time of day you prefer. And I shall see you in the next video. Bye-bye.